Hi guys, I'm Mike and this is F1 Fanatics. Sadly, yesterday we had the news that Sir Stirling Moss passed away at the age of 90. He was not only an F1 legend, but he was a motorsport legend. He was someone in his Formula 1 career. He competed in 66 races, winning 16 of them with 16 pole positions and 34 poles, and still has the record for most wins by a driver who has not gone on to win a world championship. But if you add those stats into his overall motorsport career, where he competed in 529 events, winning 212 of them, that is almost 50%, it is a measure and the mark of Sir Stirling Moss. This is his legacy. Stirling Moss was born on the 17th of September 1929, and it's fair to say that kind of motorsport ran in his family. His dad, Alfred, actually competed as an amateur racer and came 16th in the 1924 Indy 500. His mum, Eileen, actually competed in some hill climbing races as well. His sister, Pat Moss, actually went on and competed within the rallying scene as well. But Stirling Moss certainly was the kind of shining jewel in his family, and his motorsport legacy is something that is vastly impressive. But it was something that he had to fight for. At 19, he wanted to become a professional racing driver. At that time, that was something unprecedented because, you know, it wasn't really a thing. And his dad wanted him to become a dentist. But with his money, he was also an accomplished horse rider. His money that he'd won from horse riding competitions, he was able to buy a Cooper 500, and the rest, you can say, is history. He went on to impress, and in 1950 he won his first major event on the eve of his 21st birthday in the RAC Trophy. He would go on and win this competition. He won that in a borrowed Jaguar, and he would go on and win this competition a further 6 times. In 1951 in another Jaguar, 1955 in Mercedes, who, we'll get onto it, were a big part of his motorsport career, especially around about that time. In 1958, 59 and 1960 and 61 in the Ferrari 250 GTO in the 1960-61 ones. And fun fact, that is my kind of favourite of the classic cars, so certainly a slight little extra attachment to those ones for me. But it was, you know, it was pretty much, if it was a car, Stirling Moss would race it. He would compete in running events, and in 1952 he would get second place in the Monte Carlo rally, and this would actually be the highest place that he achieves in it, but still a pretty impressive place to kind of finish in the classic Monte Carlo rally. And he is actually one of only 3 men to have won the Coupe d'Or award. I hope I said that okay. But yeah, this was awarded for having 3 consecutive non-penalty runs of the Alpine Rally. So considering that only 3 people achieved it, that's something pretty prestigious to have. And endurance racing and sports car racing was really where Stirling shone and where he was dominant. And in 1954, in the 12 Hours of Spring, he would actually be the first non-American to win this race, with his partner in that race, Bill Lloyd. His affiliation with Formula 1 actually became a year before that, when Neubauer actually took an interest in Moss. He saw the talent that was there, and he recommended that he bought a Maserati 250F for the 1954 season. Now, you know, obviously it wasn't able to compete with the team of Mercedes at that time, and Fangio would go on and win the 1954 championship, his second title of the time. But in Monza of that year, Stirling Moss had impressed as he overtook the 2 standout drivers of the time in Formula 1 in Alberto Ascari and Juan Manuel Fangio, and he would lead the race up until lap 68, where he was forced to retire with an engine problem. Fangio would go on and win that race and, like I said, the title, but it was enough that Neubauer would be impressed and offer Sir Stirling Moss a contract. 1955 was probably a mix of emotions for Stirling Moss, but the one where he really kind of asserted himself on the F1 scene. He would battle Fangio, who would ultimately come out on top and was probably the better racer of the two at this stage. I think Stirling Moss said himself that the best way to kind of learn in Formula One was following one Manuel Fangio's car. And, you know, he was really the dominant era, and that would be his third World Championship that year. But Stirling Moss would beat him in the 1955 British Grand Prix at Aintree that year. And, you know, they would fight right up until the line and Stirling Moss would come out on top. It was coined as maybe one of his most controversial wins, as some people debated whether Fangio just let Moss win, as it was his home Grand Prix. But Fangio, you know, when asked by Moss, did say that, you know, Moss was just better than him on that day. And I think you could argue either way, and still probably people will debate it. But I think it's nice to know, and we'll just take Fangio on his word that Stirling Moss just had a brilliant drive for his first ever Grand Prix win. 1955 also saw, you know, probably Moss's best chance at winning Le Mans come to an end in obviously tragic style. That was also the end, well, the start of the end of his affiliation with Mercedes, because in 1955 Le Mans, Pierre Levesque lost his life tragically and caused the biggest motorsport accident in the history of motorsport, where 83 spectators lost their life and countless others were injured. And it was bigger than sport, and Mercedes retired Fangio and Moss, who were leading at the time. And I don't think Moss would have ever held any kind of regret or, you know, be gutted about that, because some things are bigger than sport, and that certainly was something that was, and would then lead on to Mercedes withdrawing from all motorsport, you know, for decades. It was that much of an impact on them. In 1955 though, also saw one of Stirling Moss's greatest ever achievements, and that was winning the Mille Miglia. And this is the 1,000-kilometre Italian race, and with his co-driver Dennis Jenkinson, he was able to finish ahead of second place Fangio by a whole 32 minutes. So although Fangio may have had the one-up on Moss in the Formula One scene, in the sports car scene, Moss was certainly his equal, if not even better. But finishing second in the 1955 Formula One World Championship, he would then go on to finish the following 3 years in second place as well. But the closest he ever came to winning the World Championship was in 1958, where he would finish 1 point behind Mike Hawthorn. And this is famous season for the Portuguese Grand Prix, where Stirling Moss actually won the race, but on going round after the lap that he had finished, he found Mike Hawthorn, and he had gone off wide and was preparing to re-enter the track. Now the steward said that Mike Hawthorn had re-entered the track illegally and had disqualified his car. Stirling Moss stepped forward and said that Mike Hawthorn hadn't, and that he had kind of touched the pavement, which actually wasn't part of the track, and so that Mike Hawthorn's position was kept within the race, and he kept his 6 points from that race. So by losing the championship by 1 point a couple of races later, it would then obviously, you know, transpire that Moss essentially gave Hawthorn the championship there. But I don't think so. And I think Stirling Moss wouldn't think so either. He would have wanted to have won in the right manner, and I don't think he would have wanted that debate, because I think, you know, today would then debate whether Mike Hawthorn should have been disqualified or not from that race. But also, he was friends with Peter Collins, who he'd competed and finished second with in Le Mans, and Peter Collins sadly at the Nürburgring that year had lost his life. and Mike Hawthorn and Peter Collins were best friends. And Mike Hawthorn had kind of lost his desire and heart for racing after the death of Peter. Him winning that championship and sadly losing his life just a short time after being crowned world champion, I think Moss would see that as fitting, as, you know, Moss's legacy has transpired F1 and he has become revered and his name lives on despite not being a world champion. But Mike Hawthorn will forever be in the history books as the first British world champion. And if you think of Mike Hawthorn, then hand in hand you go with Peter Collins. So two of his great British rivals of the time will have also their place in the history books, with Stirling Moss, although gutted, and obviously he would desperately want a world championship. I think he would find it rather fitting that it was Mike that won the championship that year and not him. From 1959 to 1961, he would come third in the championship, and this was kind of topped off by the 1961 Monaco Grand Prix performance. Stirling Moss had always wanted to drive British cars, and at that era, the drivers had the power. They were on one-year contracts, and it was often the case that the best drivers would go to the best cars of that year. Moss would want to go for the best British cars. He would, if any possible chance, be wanting to drive British cars. And this was shown in 1957 when he won the British Grand Prix with Tony Brooks, in the third and last time that two drivers had shared a car to claim victory. They would be the first British drivers to win a British Grand Prix in a British manufactured car, and that would be a record that stood for a long time after that as well. But going back to 1961 Monaco, with his love of British cars, he was driving the underpowered Lotus car compared to the far superior Ferrari. But Stirling Moss would drive that race for pretty much 90% of the time flat out, as fast as he could drive it, pushing his car to the absolute limit. I think talking about it, you know, he said, you know, I was just expecting the Ferraris to just follow me and take me in the last few laps, but, you know, I was going to make him work for it if it was, and so pushed his car as hard as he could. And he would actually finish 3.6 seconds ahead of the Ferraris in second place and win the Monaco Grand Prix. And it is stated as, yeah, by himself, his greatest ever race that he drove. But sadly, you know, showing that Moss was still the peak of his powers, he'd won the Nürburgring 1,000-kilometre race. You know, endurance racing really was where Stirling Moss shone 3 years in a row. This was a guy that showed no sign of letting up or slowing down. But in 1962, in the Glover Trophy at Goodwood, he unfortunately would have a near-fatal accident. An accident that would put him in a coma for 1 month, and then for 6 months he would have some partial paralysis. After that, he spoke about when driving that he had to concentrate more. He'd lost his kind of natural ability to drive. He had to kind of find himself having to refocus himself through the corners and through the straights. And I think smartly, he kind of noted it was my time to step away. I'd lived through an era where surviving was an achievement. So many people lost their lives during that era of motor racing. And in his near-death experience, I think probably consciously he was like, I've had a good shot at this. It's probably my time. He would still go on and compete throughout his life. And funnily enough, he would compete in British touring cars with a partner in Martin Brundle. A nice kind of British connection there going forward. But, you know, he would race all the way up until the age of 81. And I believe in 2009 was the time that he officially announced his retirement from racing. But, yeah, he had such a legacy, and he just, you know, after that crash, he's like, it's not me. I couldn't compete at the top level. So 1955 and 1961 really was the years where we saw the best of Stirling Moss, and he was truly, absolutely superb during that time. But his legacy in F1 kind of transpires that. He was a massive part in the paddock afterwards, you know, often going along to races. You know, he would share experience and share his love for the sport with people, and, you know, he would help and give advice to people going forwards because he loved F1. He loved motorsport, and, you know, he had such an infectious personality that allowed him to be this revered personality. That someone like me, you know, born in 1993, long after his, you know, participation in motorsport, and really when the main time he was relevant, knew about him. That's the biggest kind of note you can give to his legacy, that he was still spoken about, and so about Stirling Moss, because he was bigger than any British motor driver at that time. Even bigger than the likes of Mike Hawthorne, who did win that World Championship, and Peter Collins. He was just revered, and, you know, it's the funny stories that apparently policemen for a time afterwards would catch speeding motorists and go, "Who do you think you are, Stirling Moss?" And the funny story is, apparently a police officer caught Stirling Moss doing that, using that line, and had a hard time kind of coming to the realisation that it actually was Stirling Moss in the car who was speeding. But he would go on and, you know, I'd say be one of the first kind of celebrity personas. You know, you often see it with ex-sportsmen doing rounds on TV shows and everything there. Stirling Moss did that in his time in the 60s. He was loved by the public. He would actually make a cameo appearance in the James Bond movie Casino Royale. No, not the Daniel Craig one, but the original Casino Royale. And, you know, I think that shows the influence it was. People cared and wanted to know what Stirling Moss was and who he was, and that is the biggest legacy you can ever give someone. Obviously, you know, yesterday he passed away, and his wife since 1980, Susie Moss, Lady Moss, she said that he drove one lap too many, and at the end he was just tired and his eyes just shut and he drifted away. And I think that's quite fitting that Lady Moss used as kind of her way of saying goodbye to Sir Stirling, was using a racing reference, because that's where his legacy was, that's where his input was. He made an impact. Motorsport and F1 was certainly greater for having Sir Stirling Moss compete in it. F1, his legacy is that famous phrase coined, the greatest driver never to win a Formula 1 World Championship, but he was just a great driver. His achievements in other forms of motorsport say that, and he may not maybe have necessarily some of the accolades, the Formula 1 World Championship. He did win at Monaco, but didn't have Le Mans to his name, and didn't go on and drive Indy 500, but he was just a brilliant driver, and he will always be spoken about in the history books of motorsport and in the history books of Formula 1. So I round this off by saying thank you, Sir Stirling Moss, for all that you gave to F1, for all that you gave to motorsport, the kind of joy and enjoyment that you brought with your racing, your kind of gentlemanly attitude that was a mark of yourself as a man, that some things were bigger than sport, and as you coined yourself, you were a racer, not a driver, and a driver might have stood you to achieve more things in your time in motorsport, but a racer is what you'll be remembered as, and you'll be remembered as a legend, and you are truly deserving and worthy of that title.